Yes.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Up in Your Business with Kerry McCoy, a production of flagandbanner.com. Through storytelling and conversational interviews, this weekly radio show and podcast offers listeners an insider's view into the commonalities of successful people and the ups and downs of risk-taking. Connect with Kerry through her candid, often funny, and always informative weekly blog. There, you'll read, learn, and make comment about her life as a 21st century wife, mother, daughter, and entrepreneur. And now it's time for Kerry McCoy to get all up in your business.
Thank you, son Gray. Did I tell you that was my son?
You did. You
Okay,
did.
good.
I told him.
Congratulations.
Thank you. If
To both of you.
Thank you. If right now you're sitting at your computer, you might want to watch the show live on Up in Your Business with Kerry McCoy's Facebook page. But if you miss it, no worries. A YouTube video will be made available next week. This show began as a calling. After 4 decades of running a small business called Arkansas Flag and Banner, now known as flagandbanner.com, I felt I had something to share. I wanted to create a platform for not just me, but other business owners and successful people to pay forward their experiential knowledge in a conversational way. Originally, my team and I thought we'd be teaching others. But it didn't take us long before we realized that we were the persons learning. Listening to our guests has been both educational and inspiring. To quote the Dalai Lama, when you talk, you are only repeating what you already know. But if you listen, you may learn something new. The act of listening is learning. A Greek philosopher, Diogenes, wrote, "We have 2 ears and 1 tongue so that we may listen more." After listening to over 150 successful people, I've learned that many of my guests believe in a higher power, have the heart of a teacher, and are creative at building their lives and their careers. Before we start, I want to let you know, if you miss any part of today's show, want to hear it again, or you want to share it, there's a way, and Son Gray will tell you how.
Listen to all UIYB past and present interviews by going to Up in Your Business with Kerry McCoy's YouTube channel or Facebook page, arkansasonline.com, flagandbanner.com's website, or subscribe to our podcast wherever you like to listen by searching Up in Your Business with Kerry McCoy. And if you'd like to receive timely email notifications of each week's upcoming guests, go to flagandbanner.com, click Radio Show, and join the email list. Back to you, Kerry.
Thank you, Gray. My guest today, Mr. Ernie Davis, is Davis? What's wrong with me? Mr. Ernie Dumas is kind of famous around these parts because he has been writing about Arkansas politics since 1954, the year Orval Faubus defeated Governor Kerry. At the request, or should I say nagging, of CALS, the Central Arkansas Library System, Mr. Dumas has written a book, a political memoir called The Education of Ernie Dumas. Through the eyes of this revered journalist, we read deeply personal, untold stories and learn about the fragilities and strengths of some of Arkansas's most controversial and colorful public figures. How this young boy, Ernie, born in a rural South Arkansas town that had little book learning in the town, grew up to be the associate editor of the largest newspaper in Arkansas, is the story of what makes America great. With no further ado, I'll say it's a pleasure to welcome to the table political journalist first, turned author, orator, and now historian, Mr. Ernie Dumas.
Thank you, Kerry.
You're welcome. Before we get into politics and your life's work, let's talk about your rural town you grew up in, your mother and your father. And I asked you right before we came on to pronounce the name of the town, and you said it's not even there anymore.
It's called Champenolle, and it's Champagnolle.
French, I guess.
It's French, and it's named after a town in the middle of France, which I passed through there 8 or 9 years ago and saw the highway sign Champenolle, and I said, "This is where we're from." So that's the story about the Champenolle. But Champenolle was when I grew up, it really didn't exist then. I was born in 1937.
But I thought it was a sawmill town because your father worked for the sawmill.
Well, there was a sawmill. There were sawmills all around the area. That Union County and that part of Arkansas is a big lumber and timber is the biggest part, used to be the biggest part of their economy, except for oil. The two of those, oil and timber, were the big things. So my daddy he hauled logs. That's basically what he did. After he had early on hauled oil when you had the first oil boom there, but after hauling oil for this rich woman for a few months, she never paid him. So he found a lawyer and sued her and won the lawsuit, but the lawyer took all the money and said my daddy still owed him more money. So
why would a rich person not pay you?
Well, I don't know. But anyway, so my daddy said, I don't care what you do, but you cannot be a lawyer. So so he thought all lawyers were that way.
So it became a reporter. Is that any better?
Yeah. So Champenois was, it had been the county seat of the county, Union County. El Dorado subsequent was after the oil boom. But Champenois had been just a little, it was a little community on the banks of the Arkansas River, not the Washita River, the Washita River, where DeSoto allegedly had camped one night on the banks of the river there at Champenois. So that's how Champenois came into being. So,
and it's the county seat, you said it
well,
was?
it had been the county seat for a time in the 19th century.
But it's gone now.
But it's there's nothing there. Maybe it used to be when I grew up. There was a kind of a bar down at the foot of the hill where you could get a beer.
Of course.
But that was it. But there's nothing at Champenois now, and I don't think, except the cemetery where all my relatives are buried up on top of the hill.
You know, I read this in your book, and it felt like I really loved the way you wrote this, and I felt like I really knew your mother, and I loved your mother, and I loved your honesty when you wrote this. In your book, you wrote, "My mother grew up farther south on a truck farm near the sawmill town of Strong. Though sickly and possessing only one good eye, went to high school, passes the state teacher examination, and as a single girl taught in several tiny country schools."
Well, that was she. She came to teach in the little community of Champenois, and there was a wood frame building. I never saw it; it was gone by the time I was old enough to recognize anything. So that's where she taught, and in a one-room schoolhouse. And that's where she had met my father, who had gone through the 6th grade. Down there, nobody went past the 6th grade. How
did that town produce you?
Well,
nobody in that town went to college till your brother went.
Yeah, and as I say, it was not really a town to recognize anything. So
Stop
it was
in
a
the
place
road.
in the road.
Yes.
It was a place in the road on top.
So
of
how did you and your brother, the only two people to go to college from those parts?
Well, we started the school, the little Champenois school where my mother taught until she met my father, and my father was the oldest of about 8 kids, and so 2 of his brothers were in school under my mother, and I think maybe the year, maybe 2 years that she taught there. And so she married my daddy, and then the school closed. And I guess when my mother, they couldn't find another teacher, I guess, so the school closed. And so we were then routed to a little school called Quinn, which was over on the highway. And Quinn had 24 of us. The total enrollment in the school district was 24. My brother,
from 1st to 12th grade?
Well, nobody went to the 12th grade, but
8th grade.
You go through the 6th or 8th grade, and so it was one room. We had one teacher, and she would there'd be the 1st grade row and a 2nd grade row, and then maybe a 3rd grade row and a 4th grade, and if there might not be a 5th grader, and there might be one 6th grader or something, and so she would start off the morning at the 1st grade, and she would give our lessons, and then in the 2nd grade, and then she'd step over about 1-2 feet and talk to the 2nd graders. So as a student, you got to hear all the lessons all day from 1 through 4th or 5th or 6th grades. So that was until I was, going to be in the 5th grade. And the teachers there, the single teacher and her husband, who was a superintendent, and the bus driver and disciplinarian, and built the fire in the classroom and so forth, and whipped us when we needed it. So they left, and so they abolished the school district, and we went into El Dorado after that.
And so they went all the way to the 12th grade.
And they went all the way to the 12th grade.
And
El Dorado was a big, rich town.
Oh, because it had oil.
It had oil, and there were many millionaires in El Dorado.
And you had a teacher suggest to you that you should go get a job at a newspaper?
Well, I was, as I said, my father said, because nobody had gone to college, and he had gone through the 6th grade, and my mother had actually gone to high school. But nobody else down there had gone to college, and so, but everybody was going to college by that time, and so my father thought that we might go to college. So, and he suggested you ought to be an engineer, so you need to get some math and science. So my senior year, I was taking a lot of, advanced mathematics and chemistry and all those kinds of things. So, but I took journalism, of course, because my older brother had taken journalism, and it was easy. He was the sports editor of the high school paper, and of course he'd have to play. He was a big football player and track star, so I covered the games for him and wrote up the stories for him. And I was 2 years behind him, and when I was in the 10th grade. So when I was a senior, I said, well, that was easy stuff. I'll just take this journalism stuff. That's easy. You don't have to study or anything. So I took journalism in my senior year, and so the teacher was a woman named Ruth Jenkins, and I guess I owe my career to Ruth Jenkins. And so about 3 or 4 weeks into the term, and we put out one little high school paper, and I wrote some sports stories for it, I guess. So she came to me one after, said, would you like to work at the El Dorado Daily News? And I said, doing what? And she said, as a reporter, writing. And I said, well, sure. And she said, well, go down and see Bob Hayes at the Evening News Times office this afternoon and talk to him. So she said they need a reporter badly. So I skipped the bus and walked down to the News Times office and went in to see Bob Hayes, and who was the old guy who was been the editor for 30 or 40 years. And he sat me down and tossed me 3 or 4 news releases and said, boil each of these down to 150 words or something. And so I did. I sat there and typed them and put them back on his desk, and he looked at them and he said, all right, what time do you get out of school every day? And I said, well, 3:30 or something. He said, all right, well, come on down here every day when you get out of school. And so that's what I did. So after I left high school every day, I'd go down and I'd go to the courthouse and go to all the courts and the prosecuting attorney and the sheriff, and go down to City Hall and the police department and get all the news and come back, and I'd write up all of that. And
how old are you?
I would have been, I guess I was 16 when I went to work there, but I was soon to be 17. So
and
that's what I did.
why you should live in a small town.
So that's what I did. And so I worked 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week. My high school never cracked a book the rest of my senior year.
They graduated you?
And I graduated all right. And
and you went on to college to do the same thing, didn't you?
Yeah, and so then I went to college.
Did the same thing.
I did the same thing. We went into town every Saturday to the feed store to get feed for the chickens and hogs and stuff out there, and seeds. We planted. We had a little truck farm of sorts. And
where'd you go to college? Arkadelphia?
I went to Henderson State Teachers College for 3 years until they kind of ran me off.
All right, this is a great place to take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Mr. Ernie Dumas, retired assistant editor of the Arkansas Gazette, who's been writing about Arkansas politics for over 60 years. In this next segment, we're going to peek behind the curtain, so to speak, as Ernie recounts true stories from his new book and political memoir, The Education of Ernie Dumas. We'll be back right after the break.
You're listening to Up in Your Business with Kerry McCoy, a production of flagandbanner.com. Over 40 years ago, with only $400, Kerry founded Arkansas Flag and Banner. During the last 4 decades, the business has grown and changed. Over this time, Kerry's business and leadership knowledge grew. As early as 2004, she began sharing her knowledge in her weekly blog. In 2009, she founded the nonprofit Friends of Dreamland Ballroom, and in 2014, Brave Magazine, a biannual publication. Today, she has branched out into this very radio show, YouTube channel, and podcasts. Each week, you'll hear candid conversations between her and her guests about real-world experiences on a variety of businesses and topics that we hope you'll find interesting, inspiring, and educational. Stay up to date by going to flagandbanner.com and joining our email list. You'll receive our popular Water Cooler Weekly email that notifies you of upcoming guests, happenings at Dreamland Ballroom, sales at flagandbanner.com, access to Brave magazine articles, and Kerry's current blog post. All that in one weekly email. Telling American-made stories, selling American-made flags. TheFlagandBanner.com. Back to you, Kerry.
You're listening to Up in Your Business with me, Kerry McCoy, and I'm speaking today with Mr. Ernie Dumas, Politico, historian, past editor of the Arkansas Democrat, and now author of The Education of Ernie Dumas. Did I say historian? Because you definitely are. This book is so good. You have done a huge service to the people of Arkansas writing this book. Before the break, I want to tell everybody we talked about your rural upbringing and how unlikely it is for you to become who you became, but that it's really just taking advantage of opportunities that are everywhere for everybody. And you did it. I'm sure in the 10th grade when you went down there to apply for your job at the Gazette, at the paper, you were scared to death, but you did it anyway.
I don't remember whether I was scared or not. I didn't know what was.
Isn't it nice to be young
happen.
and naive?
Yes. Yeah.
All right, people that know you, this next segment is going to be fun. And people that know you are going to think this is going to be really hard for you because you're going to have to give me one word. That's the funny part, which you probably is not going to be able to do. But one word or two, or maybe a sentence, to describe each of these Arkansas governors. Your book starts with Orval Faubus. One word.
One word, Orval Faubus. I guess cunning would be Orval Faubus.
I would have thought bigot.
Well, he really wasn't. I think
I think I got that from your book.
Yeah.
For people that don't know, Orval Faubus is the one that did the Central High crisis and pulled that, because a lot of people don't realize that.
And I think he spent the rest of his life after that trying to live that down in his own mind, hoping that somehow he could transform history that would not recognize him as the villain in all of that. Mm-hmm. And I had a number of conversations with him toward the end of his life in which you could see him struggling to try to justify what he did to improve his place in history. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's Orval Faubus, kind of a tragic figure.
Tragic, cunning and tragic.
Yes.
All right, Winthrop Rockefeller.
Winthrop Rockefeller.
He's your favorite one, isn't he?
Well, in a way. He's the most unusual politician in the history of Arkansas, a successful politician. And
one word.
Perhaps in one word. I guess genuine. He was he was committed to doing something for Arkansas. It became the passion of his life to resurrect his kind of reputation, because he had fled New York City. He was part of the Rockefeller clan. He had fled New York City in disgrace because he was a notorious drunk and playboy,
gambler.
He'd married Bobo Sears, the kind of flashy B-grade actress, and then they'd had this big divorce that was on the front page of all the tabloids and everything, and he was a disgrace to the whole Rockefeller family.
That's why he came to Arkansas.
And he came to Arkansas to escape all of that and the notoriety after his divorce. And here he discovered his mission in life, which was to take this poor state and transform it into a modern state. And so that was his dream. And so he ran for office, and amazingly, with the help of a great fortune, of course, gets elected, and then felt like in the 4 years he was governor that he had failed, and so he died, and I think a very unhappy and bitter man.
He didn't live very long, did he?
He lived about 2 years after his defeat and got cancer and died.
You have a great story about him because of his drinking.
Oh yes, all right. Well, that was the story I told because And as a number of these stories in the book are stories that I revealed that I was a part of. And as a reporter, you're never supposed to be part of the story, and you try not to be. But there were several instances when I became a part of the story. This one that I think that you're referring to is as I said, he was notorious for drinking. That was his reputation. And he supposedly, there were rumors going around that he had this vast trove of pornography up on Pettigene Mountain. And that he had all this liquor, these fancy liqueurs and whiskeys from all over the world up there. There were all kind of rumors like that spread about Winthrop Rockefeller. But we in Arkansas, this was a southern Bible Belt state, and drinking was not an acceptable thing in much of the state. And you couldn't sell alcohol in much of the state, and particularly in the governor's mansion. People didn't expect the governor would not be drinking in the governor's mansion, at least since Jeff Davis was governor at the turn of the century, and he was a notorious drunk, and people loved him for drinking, and so he called himself he said there were pint Baptists and quart Baptists, and he was a quart Baptist. And then the Baptist church expelled him. So anyway, Rockefeller, this is at the end of his first term, and he's running for a second term in 1968, and against a very formidable Democratic candidate, Marion Crank, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives and a very accomplished and smart man, and backed by the Stevens interests and so forth. So it was going to be a very, very tough race for him. And because he'd been so far kind of unsuccessful in getting anything done and had kind of championed civil rights, so he was supposedly in deep trouble.
And it was early in the morning. He was making a speech.
Well, that's right. And so he called a special session of the legislature in the summer of 1968. The election is coming up in November. And he calls a special session of the legislature to get some things done. He's got a prison reform bill, and he wants to pass to try to transform this corrupt prison system.
And somebody smells alcohol in his breath?
Well, no, that's not it. So he's got all these big things he wants to do. So at special legislative sessions, typically the senators and the House members all gather in the House of Representatives, usually at 10 o'clock in the morning at the first day of the session, and the governor comes before him and addresses the session and lays out his program, what he wants him to pass. And so that usually happens kind of in the middle of a Monday morning. So Rockefeller addresses the legislative session. And he was not a good speaker. He was dyslexic, and he had to have his speeches written out so he could, in great, huge letters, so he could read it easily. And he had problems sometimes speaking, and he often slurred a few words and stopped and had to start over again and so forth. So he was not a great speaker. So he makes his speech. And so I'm covering it for the Gazette. And so typically what you do after speech, I'll go around to key legislators and ask them about the governor's program and what they think, and what might he pass and be able to pass and so forth. So I go up to Senator Clarence Bell of Parkin, who was a big, powerful man. He was from Parkin, Arkansas, over in the Delta. He's a very powerful man, chair of the Education Committee, and in some ways the most powerful man in the House of Representatives. And so I asked Senator Bell about the governor's speech, and he says, "Well, I thought he had 2 or 3 shots too many before he came here this morning." Now this is morning. You don't drink in the morning, do you? So anyway, I write it down on my notepad. And Senator Richard Earl Griffin from Crossett is standing nearby, and he echoed that, said, "Yeah, people should be able to watch that speech. They'd be ashamed of their governor." So I go down a little afterward. I go down to the governor's office to ask for to get Governor Rockefeller's comment about it, to see whether he had been drinking that morning. That's normally, we don't do things like that, but since a senator mentions his drinking, then I feel compelled to ask him about it. So I get down to the governor's office, and I go into the front door of the governor's office, and as I'm going into the governor's office, Bill Connolly, his press secretary, is coming out of his office. And so I'm in the doorway, and my notepad is in my hip pocket. And so we meet in the doorway, and I said, Bill, I need to see the governor. And he said, what about? And I said, well, I need to ask him a question. About what? And I said, well, Senator Bell said he had 2 or 3 shots too many before he addressed the legislature this morning. And so poor old Bill Connolly, just a wonderful, sweet man. And he said, Ernie, I was with him all morning, and he had 1 drink. And so anyway, I said, okay. And so he said, but the governor's going up, he's going up to Pettigene. He won't be back until this evening. So anyway, he goes on, and I pull out my notepad then, and I write his thing down.
1 drink.
Bill Connolly had the quote. So then I write a story. And it's the next day, the front page of the Gazette. Of course, the lead story of his governor's speech and the big program that he'd laid out. And down at the bottom of the page under 3-column headline, and I can still see it, the headline, and it said, Senator Bell says WR, that's what the initials were used in headline, says WR had, quote, 2-3 drinks too many. AIDS has had only 1. So that was the headline. So anyway, so Bill Connolly's account later, he was at the house the next morning, and he's still in bed early in the morning, and he gets a call. It's from Tom Isley, who was executive secretary to the governor, later a United States district judge for many, many years, died about 2 or 3 years ago, G. Thomas Isley. So Isley says, Connolly, write a letter of resignation and be at the mansion at 9 o'clock or some such time.
Wanted Connolly to resign from being Winthrop's
press secretary,
because that happened. Okay.
Yes. So Connolly said, why? And he said, have you read the Gazette this morning? And he said, no, I haven't. He said, get the Gazette and read the front page and write a letter of resignation and be at the mansion. So Connolly goes out, picks up the paper, and there he sees that story on the front page, and his heart sinks. So he sits down and writes a little 2 or 3 sentence letter of resignation and goes out, drives out to the governor's mansion. And when he gets out there, all the moguls are gathered there. John Ward, who was his Rockefeller's communications director, and Marion Burton, and Bob Faulkner. They're all the brain trust around there. They were all sitting in the living room, and he goes in, and Rockefeller's not there. He's back in his bed. He's still asleep. And so they sit there and just chew on poor old Connolly for an hour. How could you do such a thing? How could you write such a thing? You know, you've defeated him now. He's going to be beaten because of this thing. The people of Arkansas, the governor's drinking at the mansion. How could you be so stupid? And he said, well, Dumas didn't have a notepad. I didn't know he was going to quote me. And John Ward supposedly said, well, Connolly, he's a reporter. That's what reporters do. They quote you. That's what he does. And so anyway, they stay in there and they just harangue him forever. And finally, Rockefeller, somebody comes in and says, the governor is awake. So they all troop back to the bedroom, and Rockefeller's sitting there on the edge of the bed in his pajamas, scratching his head. And they go in and he said, what the hell are you guys doing in here? And so Isley goes over and grabs the letter out of Connolly's hand, takes it over and hands it to Rockefeller. And Rockefeller puts his glasses on and reads it, and he said, why is Connolly resigning? And so Isley goes and gets the Gazette, and he's got it folded back to that little thing about my little story at the bottom of the page. And so hands it to him, and Rockefeller looks at it again, reads a little bit, and then he starts laughing, and he said, hell, I'm not going to fire Connolly for lying for me. He knows I had 5 drinks if I had 1. Now get the hell out of here. I got to get dressed. So that's what happened. And so the next day he went over to North Little Rock to talk. He had supposed to talk to the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club or something. And so somebody there asked him about how many drinks if he had a drink, and and how many drinks he had before he got up to talk that morning. And so Rockefeller just kind of grinned sheepishly and held up one finger. So that's that story.
I love that story. Hell, I'm not going to fire him for saying I had 1 when I had 5. That's a good job. All right, Dale, one word for Dale Bumpers.
Integrity, I guess.
Oh, that's nice of you to say.
He was, and I say that because, well, one, he was the most effective governor in history. I mean, he was a governor for 4 years. He had no experience. He was from a small town.
His daddy thought politicians were an honorable profession.
Yeah, thought politics was a noble profession, and so he got into politics because he thought his daddy expected him to be a politician and expected him to be president of the United States.
And I don't think people realize that he took electricity to the rural areas of Arkansas.
Yes, well, that was kind of Sid McMath.
I thought that was Dale Bumpers.
Well, he did some of that, but what he did in those 4 years as governor, he passed a lot of taxes, and the biggest program in Arkansas history for education and health care.
Oh, maybe it was health care he took out to the
and parks. He created a number of new parks and redeveloped the other state parks, and he had a big highway program. So he did more in that 4 years. But the thing that I think separated him from everybody else was his obsession with honesty. And he was, and one of the, I think, revealing things in the book is that he tells me that afterward that his happiest day of his life was the day after he was elected to the Senate. And he was and so he immediately resigned as governor so he could go be sworn in to get a little seniority in the Senate. But the day he resigned as governor, leaving about 6 weeks left in his term, he said it was the happiest day of his life because every night he went to bed worrying about corruption. It's somewhere among these 25 or 30,000 state employees, somebody was doing something rotten. Somebody was doing something dishonest. And he was afraid that his children were going to read that their father was corrupt.
Oh.
And he said it just drove him crazy. And he talked about it to his wife.
Because the buck stopped with him.
Yeah, and so he said he was this vast relief when he got to
because when you're a senator, you just answer to yourself.
You got 4 or 5 employees.
All right. Let's see. David Pryor.
Well, David Pryor, just the most decent human being you could ever expect to meet, and had no ego, which was unusual for a politician not to have any kind of ego.
That is.
And the only successful politician I knew who did not have an ego, and loved everybody, and tried to do his best. And I think that was, and his 4 years as governor were difficult because we sank into recession just about the time he became governor. Dale Bumpers was also the luckiest man alive. He was just kind of born under a lucky star because everything he did worked out. When he took office, the economy was booming. Farm prices were sky high. The crops were good. Everybody was made a ton of money. The treasury filled with income, so he could build buildings on all the college campuses and everything. And so
got a lot done.
And he was just lucky.
All right,
well.
Here's a good governor. Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton was in some ways, I guess, the most accomplished and the most brilliant politician I've ever known.
So brilliant.
He was brilliant, and you recognize that immediately about him. Not only he was brilliant, he was a speed reader. He could read vast amounts of stuff very quickly and absorb it. He could read books and just flip the pages and do it. And people would write a speech for him, like as we talked about here a couple of weeks ago when he spoke here. Somebody would write a speech for him, and he would just kind of riffle through the pages very quickly and put it down, and he could just deliver that speech, and not verbatim, but very beautifully. So that's what he did. So he had this. Plus he had real charisma. So he had everything it took to be president. And you recognize right away, as many did nationally, that this guy is probably going to be president someday.
Ambitious too would be another.
He was ambitious as well.
You said in your book he's probably the most ambitious politician you ever covered.
Yeah, he was ambitious. When he had confidence, he knew he was good, and he wanted to be a great politician. He wanted to do great things.
Frank White,
he was just he was I guess honest. He was not a great politician. He didn't have in mind when he got elected governor. He didn't have a clue that he was going to be elected governor. He didn't expect to be elected governor.
Who was he running against?
He was running against Bill Clinton.
Oh, that's right. He beat Bill Clinton. Because Bill Clinton, yes.
Had kind of angered just every interest in Arkansas in his first year in office. So Frank beat him and didn't expect to. He expected to get his name out there and run, and he decided to run right at the last minute, and so he wanted to run for Congress. That was his purpose. He wanted to run for Congress, but he couldn't. So he needed to file for something, and he ran for governor so he could get well known and campaign. And then the next, in 1982, then he'd run for something real. So, but he got elected. And so
I don't think people realize that there was a lot of young people don't probably realize that Bill Clinton was the governor then for 4 years, then got defeated, and was the governor again for 8 years, making him the longest governor, I believe.
Yes. Well, actually, at that time we had 2-year terms.
I was going to say it was 2 years, and then he
got defeated after his first term.
Right.
And then he comes back and defeats Frank White in 1982, and then he.
And didn't they change it to limited 4 years after that? And prior to that, it was 2 years indefinite.
Well, you could run indefinitely. You could
2
have
year
2 year
indefinite terms.
Yeah. So Orval Faubus served 6 terms, 6 2-year terms.
2 years.
And so they changed it in 1984, I guess, to 4-year terms.
I think Clinton did it, didn't he?
They passed the constitutional amendment in I think in 1984 or 1984 general election. I think they passed it, make it a 4-year term, and you could serve
2 4-year terms.
Well, I'm not. My memory now is we might have done that later. The term limits, the term limits came in 1990. We passed a term limits amendment, limiting it to 2 terms. So there's no limit when Bill Clinton got elected. He could have been elected many more times.
Oh, all right. Here's the one I really enjoyed reading about: Jim Guy Tucker.
Jim Guy Tucker was the unluckiest politician, I guess. He was. He and Bill Clinton were kind of contemporaries and sort of adversaries because they were both bright, dimpled, Ivy League educated politicians, and with great ambitions, and they were maybe equally brilliant.
So they were vying for the same.
So they were in the same party and same philosophy about everything. They were both modernists. They wanted to get things done. And they would have a big program, but Jim Guy, their ambitions clashed very early on, and so they became not mortal enemies, but they were adversaries.
You called Jim Guy in your book swashbuckling Ivy Leaguer.
Yes,
Nobody uses the word swashbuckling anymore.
Yes, well,
except for maybe in Huckleberry Finn's book.
Well, he wanted to be a warrior. Jim Guy was.
He's a Marine.
I
was
a Marine.
Surprised to hear he was a Marine.
He joined the Marine Corps, and then he wanted to go to Vietnam.
He did, but not as a.
Well, he wanted to go to Vietnam, but he flunked the physical. He had this disease that later afflicted him and nearly killed him. But he had this kind of liver disease. And so he didn't get to go to Vietnam, and so he tried again and flunked the physical again, and so he just went on his own. So he just
as a war correspondent.
He went over there and did a
ended up writing a book about the Arkansas servicemen.
He did, and so I remember George Fisher and all of the cartoons of Jim Guy Tucker would always have him in fatigues and carrying a gun around with him. So.
Colorful, interesting guy. He's coming on the radio. I can't wait to interview him. Really enjoyed reading about him too. And then
he was unlucky because, as I say in the book, we recount how he got the Kenneth Starr investigation of the Clintons over Whitewater. Never got anything from Bill Clinton. They never were able to accuse Bill Clinton of doing anything or Hillary of doing anything in those 7 or 8 years that they investigated Whitewater and all of the other ancillary issues that flowed out of the Whitewater thing. But they did succeed in getting Jim Guy Tucker, because the strategy of prosecutions in these things is to flip people. You start off with somebody who's not some lower level person and find something that they did illegal, and everybody's done something illegal. Mm-hmm. And so they'd find somebody that got a loan from Jim McDougal's outfit and maybe got it under false pretenses, and they charged that guy with something, and then you get him to flip and say, okay, on Jim McDougal, for example, and you keep going up until you get to the big guy, Bill Clinton, who was the object. And so they went after Jim Guy Tucker over two things. One, his bankrupt. He had started some cable television franchises and declared bankruptcy in one of them, and so they accused him of having a false bankruptcy, and so he was charged with fraud on the bankruptcy, and then also for some kind of fraud connected with the lending operation
misappropriations
of Jim McDougal and this other small business administration thing that got involved in all of that. So in both instances, I think he was convicted of both. One of them he pled guilty to finally, because he was suffering from this liver ailment and he was dying, and so he pled guilty to that. Of course, it turns out later on he did not. That the bankruptcy was not fraudulent, and in fact the IRS probably owed him money. But all of that they concluded that long after he had pled guilty and was sentenced.
Which he did because he was so ill, he couldn't fight it.
And so, but the problem was, and the great injustice that was done to both his reputation and to his career, was that he's now a convicted felon, and there's nothing he can do about it.
Oh.
But because the Kennel Star and the Whitewater investigation never would say what part of the bankruptcy code he had violated, and then the judge wouldn't order the IRS or the Justice Department, the Kennel Star, to say what part of the bankruptcy code he violated. So, after he finally pled guilty, and he didn't have to go to prison, and he went up and had his
liver transplant.
They finally said, "Well, you obviously owe the IRS some money. We got to establish how much money you owe the IRS." And so finally, in 2001, long after the Whitewater investigation had ended, the judge said, "Okay, you got to tell him so we can calculate what you owe." And when they finally said, "Okay, it was section so and so," that had passed years later. So it was not the law when Jim Guy Tucker took bankruptcy. So he did not violate the bankruptcy law, so he tried to get it overturned, and the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals said, "No, once you plead guilty, no matter what, that's it. You can't go back and reverse it." So he's a convicted felon forever.
And they ended up sending him a check, I saw in your book, for $1.41.
$1.41, I believe, or something like that. Yes. So they finally said they couldn't establish whether they probably owed him some money, but they couldn't establish how much. So finally, they said, "Well, let's strike a deal." And so they sent him this check for whatever it was, $1.41. And so he didn't cash it. He framed it and put it on his wall in his living room.
That's a crying shame right there. You had quit reporting, I think, when Mike Huckabee became in office. But you're still involved. Yeah. You're still doing a lot of stuff. Give me one word for Mike Huckabee.
I'll give you a word that not many people will agree with, and he would object to: progressive.
Really?
I think, contrary to all of his image and what he claimed about himself, his record as governor, he was in office nearly 12 years, almost as long as Bill Clinton and almost as long as Orval Faubus. But what he did as governor, not what he said as governor, but what he actually got done, he raised more taxes than any governor in Arkansas history.
I don't think people realize that.
That's right, and I know that because I researched it. And when he was proclaiming when he ran for president that he was the first governor to cut taxes, and he had to constantly stop the Democratic legislature from raising taxes. So I went back and computed all the tax increases that he passed as governor and signed, and all those by Bill Clinton, who was governor for 12 years. And Mike Huckabee raised more taxes than Bill Clinton or Jim Guy Tucker, or as Dale Bumpers, who was also a tax and spender, I guess. So I think that's his record as governor, and in spite of his protests that he was an arch conservative and that he was against taxes.
Mike Beebe.
Mike Beebe, an efficient governor. I don't think that he could be ranked as a great governor because the times determine whether you're a great governor or a disastrous governor, I think. And there were easy times, so I don't know what much that he was an effective governor. There were no scandals in his administration. There's not much you can say that he accomplished except he balanced the budget. But
People
every
love
governor,
him.
Every governor.
Everybody loves him.
Everybody does. He was a very effective governor. He could get things done. He didn't try to get a great deal done because there was not a lot, I guess, he thought needed to be done. So I would rank him as an effective governor, but not as a historic governor as you would count. I think Dale Bumpers and maybe Winthrop Rockefeller, who tried to do more than any governor in Arkansas history. I think Winthrop Rockefeller, I would say, is the most liberal governor in Arkansas history and perhaps in American history.
And he's a Republican.
And he was a Republican.
Okay, that brings us up to date. Asa Hutchinson, is the jury still out?
Jury's still out on Asa Hutchinson. He's a hardworking and an effective governor. He knows what he's doing. I wouldn't agree with a great deal that he has done, particularly in the area of health care. I think he damaged the health care system. But I think he's had to work with his own party, and that's difficult to work with your own party when you might disagree with a lot of them.
You wouldn't think that'd be difficult?
Well, I mean, it is in the current times since he's relying upon Republicans to reelect him.
You said in your book, you wrote, in my long experience, 3 Arkansas politicians, Winthrop Rockefeller, Dale Bumpers, David Pryor, nearly always followed the unpopular course of moral conviction. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think they thought about things that had to be done, and in the case of all 3, I think they all thought that we needed to raise taxes because you had to build highways, you had to improve education, you had to improve higher education, you had to provide health care for people, and that's raising taxes is not a popular thing to do ever, anytime by anybody. Mm-hmm. And although I think the voters were receptive to all of that, they never punished Dale Bumpers for raising taxes. They didn't punish Bill Clinton for raising taxes. They didn't punish.
They did the first time.
Mike Huckabee. Well, he the first time he raised one tax the first time, and that was the tax on vehicle and truck license fees, and they punished him because he yielded to the pressure groups and accepted a revision of the vehicle license tag that lowered the taxes on the big trucks and raised them on those who had pickups and small vehicles. That proved to be very, very unpopular in the rural areas of Arkansas. That's what beat him in the first time.
You know, we haven't taken any breaks because it's so interesting, but I do want to tell everybody that you've been listening to Up in Your Business with me, Kerry McCoy, and that I've been speaking today with Mr. Ernie Dumas, Politico, historian, past editor of the Arkansas Gazette, and author of the book, The Education of Ernie Dumas. So newspaper policies and ethos at the time of Whitewater were this. You even alluded to it earlier that you wouldn't talk about something unless you got a quote from them. The policy of the newspapers then was no critical article could be published without the subjects involved having a chance to explain or justify their actions, even if they said no comment.
Yes, and
is
I
that
think
true today?
I think it's probably not as true today as it was. Although the media, like the New York Times and Washington Post, that's kind of their policy still, but it's not as rigid as it used to be because you can get somebody to talk about it. But I think I made that reference in connection with the Whitewater
you did
reporting. And actually before that, I think the critical part of that book, and the reason I think the most important part of the book starts with 1978. There's an election in 1978. That's the year that Bill Clinton was elected governor. But there was simultaneously there was a Senate election where David Pryor gets elected to the Senate to succeed John L. McClellan, who had died. And there are three candidates in that race: Jim Guy Tucker, and David Pryor, who was the sitting governor, and Jim Guy was the congressman from the 2nd District, and Ray Thornton, who was the congressman from the South Arkansas.
Who's the nephew of the Stevens.
And the nephew of the Stevenses.
Lots of money.
And so I think the critical point of the book is this family feud that started early in the 1970s. There's a family feud between the Stevens family, Witt and Jack Stevens, who were brothers and Witt had made a vast fortune in the gas business and also in financial. They had a
penny stocks or something.
All of that, and had an investment company. And so he and his brother made vast fortune, became the most powerful men in Arkansas, and they kind of ran politics for many years. And so they had made a young man who was also, like Bill Clinton and Jim Guy Tucker, a kind of a rising star in Arkansas. Good looking, smart, good speaker, ambitious, and all about the same age as those guys. And so Witt Stevens hired him right out of college, and then turned over the gas company to him, made him president, and stepped out. And then
made
they had a great
who
falling
the gas
out.
president?
Made Sheffield Nelson the president of the gas.
Sheffield Nelson, that's
president
right.
of Arkansas, Louisiana.
And then
gas
he turned on him.
And then they had a falling out. And both of them, you could say both of them were kind of justified. They both had their own
That's
theories.
an interesting.
Yeah, it's
that's
a complicated
a whole interesting chapter. What was the name of that chapter?
I've forgotten what the name of the chapter was, but anyway, it's late in the book, but it starts 78.
It's really good. We are almost out of time. 1 minute. I'm getting the signal. Y'all, this book is so good. It should be mandatory reading for everybody in Arkansas. Ernie, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for writing this book. We are forever grateful to you. Here's your gift today, in case you don't have one, a U.S. and Arkansas flag for your desk. Do you have one already?
I do not.
Isn't it amazing how many people don't have a U.S. and Arkansas flag on their desks?
I don't.
I just want to say to everybody, thanks for listening today. We hope you've heard or learned something that's been inspiring or enlightening, and that whatever it is, we hope that it will up your life, up your business, up your independence. I'm Kerry McCoy, and I'll see you next time on Up in Your Business. Until then, be brave and keep it up.
You've been listening to Up in Your Business with Kerry McCoy. For links to resources you heard discussed on today's show, go to flagandbanner.com, select radio, and choose today's guest. All interviews are recorded and posted the following week. Subscribe to podcasts wherever you like to listen. Kerry's goal is simple: to help you live the American dream.